Jeff Gunlock says the dollar is doomed. Editor, go ahead and cut to the clip from CNBC.
In the longer term, I think the dollar, I don't want to be overly dramatic, but I think I will use the word doomed in the long term.
Now I'm going to explain why he made this prediction in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over the twin deficits, more specifically the budget deficit. This is when your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam spends more money into the real economy than he takes out through taxes. So what would happen in this process is the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, would have to issue treasuries, bonds, debt of the United States government. And the entities or individuals in the real economy would buy those bonds, those treasuries, and this would have the same effect. Those dollars would come out of the real economy, just like through taxes, and then your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam would spend those dollars, redistribute them back into the real economy in an effort to buy your vote. But notice, on net balance, the amount of dollars in the system haven't changed. But now things are much different. Going back to 2020, a lot of the treasuries that were issued were purchased by the Fed. So instead of sucking those dollars out of the real economy to begin with and then redistributing the same dollars, what's happening is Janet Yellen is selling the treasuries to the Fed. They're going onto the asset side of the Fed's balance sheet, but how are they buying them? What are they using to buy those treasuries? They're using bank reserves. Those are the dollars of the Fed. But what's interesting about bank reserves is they really don't circulate in the real economy. They're a different form of dollars, just really a liability of the Fed, an asset of the commercial banking system. So what ends up happening is when the Fed is buying the treasuries with bank reserves, those dollars are not being sucked out of the real economy to begin with. So when those dollars are spent into the real economy, then on net balance, the dollars that are on the balance sheet of non-banks in the real economy. That's a very important distinction. More on that later. But the amount of dollars on the balance sheets of the non-banks in the real economy increases. You have more dollars circulating, chasing goods and services. This makes the dollar depreciate in value, go down against the stuff that you buy on a daily basis. So just to review, to make sure we're on the same page, usually the government takes those dollars out of the real economy through taxation or selling bonds and then redistributes them. So on net balance, there is no increase to the amount of dollars on the balance sheets of non-bank entities in the real economy. But now things are much different. Those treasuries are going over to the Fed. They're paying for them with bank reserves. So when your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam spends those dollars back into the real economy, on net balance, the amount of dollars in the system circulating, chasing goods and services increases. Therefore, this gives a tailwind to consumer price inflation. Oh, time out. I know a lot of you right now are saying to yourself, wait a minute, George. The Fed can't buy treasuries directly from the government. They've got to buy them from the primary dealer banks, so the banks under the Fed's umbrella. Therefore, if the dollars are coming off of the bank's balance sheet to begin with, and those banks are in the private sector, even when your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam spends the dollars into the real economy, still the private sector, on net balance, the amount of dollars in the system doesn't increase. And this is a very good observation. But what we have to do is take a step back and remember, we're trying to figure out the probabilities. The dollar is doomed against the stuff you buy on a daily basis. In other words, are we going to see significant consumer price inflation into the future? Is inflation transitory, or is it something more permanent like we saw in the 1970s? And to get our head around this, we've got to compartmentalize where the dollars can exist. First, they can exist on the Fed's balance sheet. Those are the bank reserves we talked about before. They're denominated in dollars, but they really don't circulate in the real economy. The second place is the financial system. So let's go back to the bank's balance sheet. Those dollars that were there originally, they can be liabilities of the Fed, bank reserves, but they can also be liabilities of another commercial bank. It's the exact same thing as you having an account with Wells Fargo, Chase, Bank of America. Those dollars that you have in your account are not a liability of the Fed, but they're a liability of that particular bank. So just to reiterate here, the dollars on the bank's balance sheet can be a liability of the Fed or the commercial banking system. But the third is by far the most important. Those are the dollars that exist as assets on the balance sheet of the average Joe and Jane, the entities in the real economy, the non-bank entities. Because at the end of the day, these are the dollars that are in the real economy circulating, chasing goods and services. That needs to be our number one focus. So my point is, even if the banks are using dollars to buy the treasuries initially that are liabilities of other commercial banks instead of using dollars that are liabilities of the Fed, it still increases the amount of dollars that are on the balance sheet of non-banks in the real economy, providing more of a tailwind to inflation. I agree with Milton Friedman that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. But we can have dollars in the financial economy go down while at the same time we have dollars in the real economy increase. And this is exactly what's happening when the United States government runs $4 to $5 trillion deficits that are being monetized or purchased outright by the Fed, even if it's going through the shell game with the primary dealer banks. And editor, let's go ahead and throw up a couple charts. The viewers can see this clearly when we look at M2 money supply in 2020, and then we look at the increase in size of the Fed's balance sheet during the same time frame. You see they're going up almost in lockstep. So if the government continues to run these extreme deficits, where the treasuries end up on the balance sheet of the Fed, that is going to increase M2 money supply. In other words, it's going to increase the amount of dollars that are circulating in the real economy chasing goods and services, even if it's decreasing the amount of dollars that the banks have that are liabilities of other commercial banks. That's the key component here. That's why I wrote key right here with an exclamation point in case you missed it. All right, now moving on here. How big are these deficits? Because that's really an important question to answer. We've got a chart going back to 2000 all the way to 2020. And we start off in 2000 when the United States actually had a budget surplus. We had more money coming in than we were actually spending. Imagine that. But in 2002, we got right back to our good old deficit spending. And it really shot up during the GFC, as you can imagine. In 2009, going almost to $2 trillion, which at the time we thought was an astronomical number. Then it goes down, fast forward, we get Trump in office, and he's spending money like a drunken sailor. He's definitely part of this group, one of your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sams, that's for sure. To the point where in 2019, although we had the greatest economy in human history, they were running almost $1 trillion budget deficit. Then we get to 2020, where the deficit goes all the way up to almost $5 trillion. Now, on this chart, which I think is projected, you can see that it goes up to maybe 3 trillion, 3.5 trillion. But when you look at the total amount of debt for the United States government, you see that the increase in 2020 was, like I said, almost $5 trillion. A staggering amount, especially when you consider that between 1776 and 1996, the first 220 years, the government was in existence. They racked up $5 trillion in debt. And in 2020, we racked up $5 trillion in debt in just 1 year. But it's even more important to understand how the money was spent when we're trying to figure out if the dollar is doomed. Are we going to see significant consumer price inflation continue into the future? So let's remember that this $5 trillion, a lot of it went out as stimmy checks, additional unemployment, child tax credits, you name it. It's increasing the amount of dollars that are on the balance sheet of non-banks. And what we're doing with those average Joe and Jane is we're paying them more than they were making it their job to stay home and not do anything. In other words, we're paying people to create fewer goods and services. Well, what happens if we're creating fewer goods and services, but yet the amount of dollars on the balance sheet of the average Joe or circulating in the real economy is increasing? You're going to see prices go up. And that's exactly what we have seen over the past 12 months. How many of you watching this video right now have seen the prices of what you buy on a daily basis go up by 5%, 10%, maybe even north of 15%? I know I definitely have in my own personal life. So if the government continues to increase its deficit spending, going from 5 trillion to 7 trillion to 10 trillion, and that deficit is monetized by the Fed. Those treasuries go onto the Fed's balance sheet paid for by bank reserves. Regardless of what's happening with the banking system, that means that the probabilities are extremely high that over the long run, the dollar is definitely doomed. Step number 2. We talked about the budget deficit in step number 1. Now, let's talk about the other component of the twin deficits, the trade deficit. This is basically when the United States imports more goods than it exports. So therefore, the difference would have to be made up in green pieces of paper, dollars that will circulate in the global economy outside of the United States. So, as an example, if the United States imports $100 billion worth of stuff from China for Home Depot, Walmart, and Target, and doesn't export any goods to China, then there would be $100 billion that would be going outside of the United States to pay for those goods. Or using different numbers, if we import $100 billion worth of stuff from China and we export $50 billion worth of stuff, then there would be an additional $50 billion that would be getting into the global economy, circulating, therefore creating additional dollar supply. So now let's move on to a chart going all the way back to 1960 to today. And this is the trade deficit of the United States. And we can see right off the bat, when we were on the gold standard, there really wasn't a trade deficit at all. But then insert 1971. You all know what happened then. That's when Nixon took us off the gold standard. And mysteriously, our trade deficit started to go up and down and then dramatically increase. Again, I want to point out on this chart, as the line goes down, that indicates the trade deficit is increasing. So on the left, we go from 0 down to $80 billion. So during the 1980s, trade deficit explodes, relatively speaking. And then in the late 80s, it goes back up. But then throughout the 90s, going down to 2003 or 4, the trade deficit gets far, far worse. Really just falls out of bed. We go from having about a $10 billion trade deficit in the 80s to over a $60 billion trade deficit in the early 2000s. And it improves slightly and pretty much has gone straight down since the GFC. And it really falls out of bed during the cerveza sickness. Well, why is that? Well, let's think this through. Going back to step number 1, we talked about how the budget deficit has exploded, and this has put more dollars onto the balance sheet of non-bank entities. But remember, what are we doing? with those dollars? How are those dollars getting onto the balance sheet of the non-bank entities? Through stimmy checks, where we are literally paying people to produce fewer goods by staying home. Well, if people are producing fewer goods, but yet they are consuming just as many goods, if not more, where are those goods coming from? They're coming from China or Japan or Europe or someplace other than the United States. That's why you see this trade deficit explode during 2020 and continue in 2021. So why does this matter for the dollar? Because it's simply supply and demand. As those dollars increase in the United States on the balance sheets of the non-bank entities, the average Joe and Jane, that means more dollars chasing the same amount or fewer goods and services. Exactly what we talked about in step number 1. So that's downward pressure on the dollar relative to the stuff you buy on a daily basis. But globally, the same dynamics are at play. It's supply and demand. So the more dollars that we're pumping outside of the United States into the global economy, the more downward pressure that we are putting on the dollar against other fiat currencies that aren't running such a massive trade deficit, or maybe even are running a trade surplus. And to see how the twin deficits have affected the dollar over the last few decades, editor, let's go ahead and throw up a chart. This goes back to 1966, and we can see that there's definitely a correlation between the twin deficits getting worse and the dollar going down. Pretty much the only exception is when Volcker raised rates up to 16, 17, 18% during the early 1980s. So when the twin deficits get worse, the dollar loses purchasing power. But the big question to determine whether or not the dollar is doomed long term is to figure out if these twin deficits will continue into the foreseeable future. And that is what we are going to explore right now. Step number 3. Are the twin deficits transitory or are they permanent? And if they're permanent, will we see the deficits continue to increase in size, leading to the dollar being doomed over the long run? Let's start by going back to a chart of the Fed's balance sheet. We start in 04, go all the way to today's date. And prior to the GFC, you'll notice the Fed's balance sheet was about $800 billion. But then we started quantitative easing. And remember when Ben Bernanke came out with QE1, it wasn't called QE1. It was just called quantitative easing. Why? Because he told us that it was merely temporary. There wasn't supposed to be a QE2, a QE3, a QE4, and now what we have, which is QE infinity. If QE worked in the first place, why do we have to do it so many times? That really needs to be the first question that we answer. And of course, it's because QE in and of itself doesn't work. Now you may say, George, it increases the level of the stock market. And maybe it does that. Not directly, but indirectly through the psychology that it creates with the market participants. But regardless, what it tells us is that the Fed has now entered this monetary roach motel, as Peter Schiff calls it. That once you go in, you can never leave. It's like the Hotel California, I guess. Maybe another example. And why? Because what we've done is we've created an economy that is addicted to the Fed continuing, and not only to continuing, but increasing the levels of quantitative easing, even if it is psychological. That's why I have everybody's favorite, from the streets of San Francisco, heroin guy, because it's the exact same thing. Once you get on the drug, you need more and more of the drug to achieve the exact same effect. And we see this happening with quantitative easing. Now, what's key, though, is going back to March of 2020. Here, I think we went from a Fed put to a government put. And the reason I say this is because if you go back to that time, you'll recall the Fed had to set up an emergency meeting on a Sunday where they dropped rates down to 0% and announced QE infinity and committed to doing $1 trillion a day in the repo market. But what did the market do, the stock market, the very next day? It was still down by over 1,000 points, if my memory serves me right. It was down dramatically, that's for sure. And what ended up happening? The market shrugged it off. It said, Fed, we don't care about your put anymore. Well, why did the market reverse? Because the government came out and announced all of this fiscal spending, the stimulus packages, the CARES Act, if you will. When the stock market saw that, it reversed and started to go back up to the point where it is today. This is why I believe we've gone from a Fed put to a government put. Well, let's think this through. If once the Fed started the monetary heroin, they needed to not only stay the course, but increase the size, increase the amount of the drug they were taking. Why won't it be the exact same thing with the government put? And the government put, if you're not following what I'm saying, is deficit spending, fiscal deficit spending. So now we've put ourselves into a position where the government has to continue to not only deficit spend, but deficit spend in increasing amounts in order for the heroin addict, in this case the economy, to achieve the exact same effect. Let me give you an example that really helps you get your mind around what's going on. Prior to all of this monetary insanity, bailouts, moral hazard, central planning, the real economy actually produced goods and services. Imagine that. And that's what drove the stock market. It makes sense because the stock market is just an aggregation of the businesses, or some of them, in the real economy. Therefore, the better the real economy does, the more efficiently it produces goods and services, the better the stock market would do. It's just like a hot air balloon that you would see on a Sunday morning, that wherever that balloon goes, it takes the basket along with it. So in this visual, imagine that hot air balloon being the real economy and the basket being the stock market. But what we have today is something that is completely switched to where the hot air balloon is the financial economy. It's the stock market. It's real estate prices. And now with all of this government spending and the government put, it's free stuff. So it's free dollars, UBI. It's free housing. It's free children. It's free, you name it. That's what the economy is now addicted to. That's what it's built around. Asset prices and freebies from the government. Well, let's think about this. If the asset prices are dependent upon the government deficit spending, and obviously the free stuff is as well, what is most likely going to happen to these deficits in the future? Are they going to go down? Absolutely not. It's going to be the exact same thing as quantitative easing. It's going to go up and up and up and up. It's never going to end. And if it doesn't end, if it only increases in size, this, of course, puts massive downward pressure on the dollar. The dollar is really the only release valve long term. Oh, but wait, there is more. Let's not forget about the trade deficit we discussed in step number 2. If the government is doing all of this deficit spending, they're going to be paying people to stay home and not produce goods. Also, as the government spends more and more money, it creates economic distortions in the real economy. And let's not forget about the regulations that are coming down right now as we speak in local governments all around the United States. As an example, New York City yesterday just announced that they have a vaccine mandate. So in order to go to a restaurant or a gym, you have to show them that you have been vaccinated. Well, how does that work with all the tourists coming in from all over the world, not to mention the United States, who might not want to be vaccinated? You have to ask yourself whether you think that's a good idea or not. That's not what we're talking about here in this video. What we're talking about is, does that increase the amount of productivity? Does it increase the amount of goods and services produced if the government spending is a higher and higher and higher percentage of GDP? Are we producing more goods or fewer goods as a result of the government paying people to stay home and not produce? Are we producing more goods or fewer goods by increasing regulation on small and mid-sized business, by increasing tax rates on small and mid-sized business? Obviously, the answer is we're creating an environment where society at large is going to produce far less stuff. But if we're giving people far more dollars, then they're going to consume the same amount. So where are the goods going to come from that all of these Americans are consuming with the dollars they're getting from the government? Of course, it's going to come from foreign countries. Well, if foreign countries are exporting the goods, we are importing them, then by definition, we are exporting more and more dollars to them. That trade deficit is becoming larger and larger and larger. So what I'm saying here is, if you believe the budget deficit is going to increase in the future, then you also have to believe the trade deficit is going to increase in the future, most likely at the same rate. And if the twin deficits continue to increase in the future, then the dollar, as Jeff Gundlach points out, is doomed. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.